It's my pleasure to yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, the chief sponsor of the legislation.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for as much time as he consumes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the House Judiciary Committee, the chairman, ranking member, for unanimously advancing the Combat Online Predators Act for full consideration of the House today. And I'm also very appreciative of Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida for her tireless bipartisan leadership in protecting our nation's children. This bipartisan legislation was inspired by the story of the Zezo family of Bucks County, Pennsylvania, whose teenage daughter, Madison, was cyber-stalked by a friend's father on social media. Despite the stalking being sexual in nature, the then 51-year-old stalker pleaded guilty only to a misdemeanor stalking charge and was sentenced to probation and counseling. 3 years later, in 2016, the very same stalker began making contact again. This time, he was arrested in a sting operation by local police and sentenced to between 18 months and 7 years in state prison. Mr. Speaker, the Zezo family is here with us today. Their story is the reason that this legislation was written and the reason it will get a full floor vote on the U.S. House of Representatives today. When I first met the Zezo family in my office, their sense of fear and anxiety was evident. After hearing of the disturbing story of cyberstalking endured by this young girl and her family for years, something needed to be done. As legislators and as citizens, we have no higher calling and no higher responsibility than to protect our children. We must do everything we can to forcefully respond to egregious instances of stalking and cyberstalking, especially when committed against minors. Our children are the most vulnerable among us. Mr. Speaker, stories like this, unfortunately, are too common in this country, and they cannot always end and do not always end with the stalker in custody. The Combat Online Predators Act ensures that not only are we increasing penalties for these crimes, but also requiring federal law enforcement officials to evaluate and update best practices to combat online stalking and online bullying. This bill provides enhanced criminal penalties for stalkers under Title 18 of the U.S. Code, giving judges more flexibility to impose harsher punishments. Additionally, the Attorney General and the Department of Justice will be required to produce an evaluation of federal, state, and local efforts to enforce laws relating to cyberstalking and identify and describe elements of these law enforcement efforts that constitute best practices around the nation. Cyberstalking is a serious crime that needs to be met with stricter penalties and more cooperation amongst law enforcement agencies both on the federal, state, and local level. The Combat Online Predators Act is the first step in making the internet a safer environment for all users, especially our children. And this step cannot come soon enough. As the National Center for Victims of Crime stated in its endorsement of this legislation, in today's age where children can be stalked both in person and online, we must ensure that our laws provide real justice for our most vulnerable victims. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Zezo family, and in particular Madison Zezo, for sharing her story so that kids across this nation can be protected. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Texas.